Commerce Alive Today presents
F.W. Woolworth. The history of F.W. Woolworth Company may be traced back to the company's founder, Frank Winfield Woolworth, who parlayed the idea of the 5 and 10-cent store into an international retailing empire. Born in 1852, in Rodman, New York, Woolworth moved to Watertown, New York, in 1873 where he apprenticed and then clerked with Augsbury & Moore, a wholesaler and dry goods store. Wanting more money, Woolworth soon left Augsbury & Moore for A. Bushnell & Company, a local dry goods and carpet store. His new employer, however, found him a poor salesman and lowered his wages from $10 to $8 a week. In response, Woolworth overworked himself, had a complete breakdown, and spent 6 months convalescing. When Woolworth recovered in 1876, he returned to his former employer William Moore, whose business was now called Moore & Smith. There he concentrated on window displays. In 1878, Moore & Smith found itself with high debt and excess inventory. To raise money, the store held a 5-cent sale. Smith and Woolworth laid a group of goods such as tin pans, wash basins, button hooks, and dippers, along with surplus inventory, on a counter over which they hung a sign reading, "Any article on this counter, 5 cents." After the sale, Frank Woolworth was convinced a 5-cent strategy could work on a broader basis. In 1879, Woolworth left Moore & Smith. On February 22 of that year, he opened his first great 5-cent store in Utica, New York. At first business was good, but as the 5-cent novelty faded, the store's poor location became a handicap and he closed it in early June. Still, he had repaid Moore & Smith's loan of $315.41, which he had used for his initial inventory, and had made $252.44 in new capital. On June 21, 1879, Woolworth opened his second great 5-cent store in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. This time he had 3 windows on a main street and $410 worth of goods. The store was a success. The first day he sold 31% of stock. In succeeding months, he changed the store's name, first to 5 and 10, and later to Woolworths. The additional 10-cent items allowed him to search out further bargains. Woolworth soon began opening new outlets. Some stores succeeded, while others failed. By the mid-1880s, there were 7 Woolworths in New York and Pennsylvania. Most were run by partner managers. These men Woolworth's brother, Charles Sumner Woolworth, his cousin, Seymour Horace Knox, former employer, W. H. Moore, and Fred M. Kirby ran the stores in which they held a 50% interest. Frank Woolworth ran the initial store and took care of purchasing. In succeeding years, these partner managers bought out Frank Woolworth's shares and began opening chains on their own. Woolworth continued opening stores. After 1888, he did so completely with his own capital. In these new stores, he entered into a profit-sharing agreement with managers. While Woolworth owed much of his success to low prices, his treatment of the customer was also important. In the 1870s and 1880s, patrons usually had to ask for goods held behind the counter, and prices varied according to the customer. It was considered impolite to enter a store without buying. Woolworth changed all that. His merchandise sat on counters for everyone to see. His price was the same for everyone. He encouraged people to enter the store even if they were just looking. Another reason for Woolworth's success was the decline in wholesale prices during the first 12 years of Woolworth's existence. This led to wider availability of goods in the 5 and 10-cent price range, wider margins, and higher profits. As operations grew, Woolworth found he needed a New York City office from which he could govern his stores. In July 1886, he took an office on Chambers Street. Soon after, he began writing a daily letter that went out to all store managers. In 1888, Frank Woolworth contracted typhoid. Until then, he had handled everything from accounting to ordering to inspecting stores. However, after 2 months in bed, he realized the importance of delegating authority. With that in mind, he chose Carson C. Peck to run day-to-day operations. Peck had been a fellow clerk at A. Bushnell & Company and a partner manager in Woolworth's Utica, New York, store. He became Woolworth's first general manager. Freed of day-to-day operations, Woolworth made his first European buying trip in 1890. On his return, U.S. consumers flocked to his stores to obtain pottery from England and Scotland, Christmas decorations from Germany, and other goods from the great commercial fairs of Europe. The same year, Woolworth established the approved list. On the approved list were goods that Woolworth would reorder for his managers. This system allowed managers the leeway to adjust stock for local preferences while at the same time benefiting from the chain's buying power. In 1897, Woolworth opened his first Canadian store, in Toronto, Ontario. 3 years later, there were 59 Woolworths with sales of $5 million. By 1904, Woolworth was opening stores at a fantastic rate. He opened some stores from scratch. Others he converted from small chains he bought. In 1905 he incorporated as F.W. Woolworth and Company. At this point, Woolworth had $10 million in sales in 120 stores. In 1909, Woolworth sent 3 associates overseas to open the first of what was to be a hugely successful group of English stores, known as 3 and sixpence stores. In 1910, he appointed the first resident buyer in Germany, and, in 1911, he opened his first overseas warehouse at Fürth, Germany. At this point competition began to increase from such retailers as J.G. McCrory and S.S. Kresge Company. Also, many former partner managers had chains of their own. In 1912, Woolworth saw the opportunity to create a huge new entity. He merged with 5 other retailers, W. H. Moore, C. S. Woolworth, F. M. Kirby, S. H. Knox, and E. P. Charlton. All were former partner managers except for Earl Perry Charlton, who had built a chain of his own west of the Rocky Mountains. F.W. Woolworth and Company became the publicly traded F.W. Woolworth Company, a nationwide retailer with 596 stores and $52 million in sales. Frank Woolworth was chief stockholder and president. The new retailing behemoth took residence in the 60-story neo-Gothic Woolworth building in New York City. Frank Woolworth's office, within the $13.5 million Skyline Queen, was a replica of Napoleon Bonaparte's Empire Room. In 1915, Carson Peck died. Peck had been supervising day-to-day operations since 1888. Woolworth assumed Peck's duties, but the strain proved to be too much. On April 8, 1919, Woolworth himself died. To succeed him as president, the board named Hubert T. Parson, Woolworth's first bookkeeper and later a company director and secretary-treasurer. The board also named Charles Sumner Woolworth, F.W. Woolworth's brother, chairman of the board. Expansion continued under Parson. The company sent its first buyers to Japan in 1919. In 1924, it opened stores in Cuba. Woolworth inaugurated a German operating subsidiary in 1926, and, in 1927, opened its first German store. By the company's 50th anniversary in 1929, there were 2,247 Woolworth stores in the United States, Canada, Cuba, England, and Germany. Sales topped $303 million. In the United States, F.W. Woolworth was far and away the biggest 5 and 10 retailer. Its 2,100 U.S. stores had 1929 sales of $273 million. By comparison, J.G. McCrory had about 220 stores with $40 million in sales, and S.S. Kresge had about 500 stores with $147 million in sales. The Great Depression caused the first decline in the company's sales since 1883, reaching a low of $250 million in 1932. In 1931, the company sold off part of its British operations, allowing that subsidiary to become a public company. In 1932, Hubert Parsons retired and Byron D. Miller became the company's third president. Miller had worked his way up in the company and had helped start Woolworth's UK operations. Among Miller's first acts was to raise the 10-cent price ceiling to 20 cents. Woolworth was the last 5 and 10 chain to raise its prices. After 3 years in office, Miller retired and Charles Deo became president. On taking office in 1935, Deo and the board of directors removed all arbitrary price limits. Sales turned upward during the late 1930s, but World War II posed new problems. Nearly half of Woolworth's male employees entered the armed forces, as did many female employees. During the war, women managed 500 stores. Demand expanded. Supplies were limited, but consumers tolerated substitutions, and because the war meant labor shortages, consumers also tolerated less service. Prolonged slump following World War II. In 1946, Alfred Cornwell succeeded Deo as president, while Deo remained on as CEO. Under Deo and Cornwell, Woolworth had difficulties adapting to the post-war rush of discount houses, supermarkets, and shopping centers. According to a 1965 Dunn's Review article, Woolworth was mired in a depression mentality. It was keeping costs down and prices low at a time when customers wanted service and when prosperity made prices a secondary consideration. the situation began to deteriorate, and, in 1953, earnings hit a 5-year low of $29.8 million. Concerned with what was happening, 3 board members Alan P. Kirby, Seymour H. Knox, and Fremont C. Peck forced Woolworth to create a new forward-looking finance and policy committee to combat what they saw as the management's overly conservative tendencies. Woolworth's British operation was having similar problems. Consumers were abandoning the stores for supermarkets and rivals such as Marks & Spencer, British Home Stores, and Littlewoods. In response, Woolworth increased the number of stores in England but did little to upgrade the existing outlets. In 1954, James T. Leftwich became president. Leftwich addressed some of Woolworth's problems and spent $110 million to expand, modernize, and move stores. In 1956, Woolworth opened 2 stores in Mexico City, and, in 1957, began operations in Puerto Rico. Much was left to be done, however, under the leadership of Robert C. Kirkwood, who took over as president in 1958. Under Kirkwood, Woolworth raised price limits and added profitable soft goods such as clothing and fabrics. Kirkwood also introduced self-service, opened hundreds of new stores, enlarged or relocated hundreds of others, and pushed Woolworth into shopping centers. Further, he increased advertising, instituted formal job training, and shortened hours and improved benefits for traditionally underpaid salespeople, a move that reduced costly employee turnover from 43% to 19%. Yet while Kirkwood was rejuvenating Woolworth, competitors such as Kresge and W.T. Grant had already overhauled their stores and were moving into new lines and new locations. Each was able to surpass Woolworth in earnings growth. In fact, while Woolworth sales surpassed $1 billion for the first time in 1960, U.S. earnings dropped from $14 million in 1960 to $12.6 million in 1963. It was only the return from British Woolworth that enabled consolidated earnings to keep moving upward. British stockholders later accused the U.S. board of milking the English operation without infusing the proper amount of capital. Woolworth and Kresge both sought new types of stores that would better fit the changing retail environment. In 1962, Woolworth opened the first Woolco, and S.S. Kresge opened the first Kmart. Each offered the services of a full-line department store and was very large in some locations, more than 100,000 square feet. Woolworth had 17 Woolco stores by 1965, and as the 1960s continued, Woolworth expanded, diversified, and modernized. In 1965, it acquired the G.R. Kinney Corporation for $39 million. Founded by George Romana Kinney in 1894, Kinney had 584 family shoe stores in 45 states. The same year, Lester A. Burcham became president of Woolworth. Under Burcham, Woolworth expanded operations into Spain and established a buying office in Tokyo. 2 years later, it opened the first Woolco in England. In 1968, sales topped $2 billion, and, in 1969, Woolworth acquired Williams the Shoeman, an Australian shoe store chain that has since become a dominant force in Australian shoe retailing with more than 460 stores ranging from high fashion to athletic and family footwear. Also in 1969, Woolworth acquired Richmond Brothers Company, a manufacturer and retailer of men's and boys' clothing. Finally, as part of a 90th anniversary celebration, Woolworth replaced the old Diamond W logo with a modern-looking white W on a light blue field. Yet Woolworth was still not growing at the rate of its competitors. By 1970, sales at Kresge were running essentially neck and neck with Woolworth. One problem was British Woolworth. In 1965, Woolworth's 52.7% owned subsidiary, FW Woolworth Limited, had contributed 50% of the parent company's profits, but during the late 1960s it began a steep decline. The reasons included a lack of investment, a devaluation of the pound, and an increase in employment taxes. By 1969, the British subsidiary was contributing just 30% of profits. In an effort to gain market share, British management cut prices. Sales grew, but profits fell. John Roberts, who became Woolworth's president in 1970, also needed to address problems at Woolco, which was performing at nowhere near the rate of Kmart. His solution was to consolidate Woolworth and Woolco in one division in 1972. Rather than providing economies, however, the consolidation only blurred the identity of each chain. Woolworth's 1973 sales were $3.7 billion, Kresge's were $4.6 billion, 90% of which was generated by Kmart. A positive event occurred, however, in 1974, when the Kinney Shoe Division opened the first 2 Foot Locker stores, athletic shoe retailers that would later prove highly profitable. With stock prices on the wane, the board recognized the need for change, and, in 1975, named outsider Edward Gibbons president. Gibbons in turn named W. Robert Harris the first president of the U.S. Woolworth and Woolco division. In 1978, consolidated annual sales topped $6 billion, of which Kinney, growing at a rate of 18 to 20% a year, contributed $800 million. Also in 1978, Harris became president and Gibbons became chief executive officer. While Woolco continued its sluggish growth and Woolworth stores suffered neglect, F.W. Woolworth Company continued diversifying. In 1979, Woolworth opened the first J. Branham, a men's clothing store whose name stood for just brand names. J. Branham was a quick moneymaker and often stood within or beside otherwise lackluster Woolco department stores. No matter how much the management tinkered, the problems of Woolco refused to go away. After the stores lost $19 million in 1981, Harris and Gibbons hired Bruce G. Albright to revive the ailing chain. Albright, who had come from competitor Dayton Hudson's Target stores, had a plan to revive Woolco, but company projections still saw the stores losing money. After Woolco lost $21 million during the first 6 months of 1982, Gibbons decided to shut down all 336 Woolcos in the United States, shrinking the $7.2 billion company 30% and laying off 25,000 employees. Closing costs were estimated at $325 million. In the fall of 1982, Woolworth disclosed plans to sell its interest in British Woolworth to a group of English investors for $279 million. One analyst, quoted in Businessweek, October 11, 1982, blamed British Woolworth's failure on the U.S. parent, saying, "The American Woolworth has been milking the British unit for years, insisting on high dividend payout that has forced it to scrimp on investment and to take on more and more debt." Analysts, however, were pleased with the company that remained. Left was the profitable, but shaky, 1,300 variety stores, Richmond Brothers, and Kinney Shoe Corporation, a $1.1 billion division that had done well with Kinney, Foot Locker, a women's clothing store known as Susie's Casuals, and the newly created and profitable J. Branham. Woolco's closing, however, left 28 of the 41 J. Branham outlets homeless. Edward F. Gibbons died suddenly in October 1982. Contrary to expectations and much to the chagrin of younger talent, the board named company veteran John W. Lynn chief executive officer. As a variety store man, Lynn paid close attention to Woolworths. He changed merchandise, reducing the number of high-priced items such as appliances and dresses and expanding basic lines like candy and health and beauty aids. He arranged stores in arrow patterns to cut down on unprofitable corners. Lynn pushed the company to adopt a set of strategic priorities that angled Woolworth away from money-losing businesses and toward specialty retailing. Kinney's Canadian operation had started the remarkably successful Lady Foot Locker in 1982, and in 1983 Woolworth paid $27 million for Holtzman's Little Folk Shop, a full-price children's clothing merchandiser, and its subsidiary, Kids Mart, a discount operation. Lynn retired in 1987, and the board named Harold Sells as the new chief executive officer. Sells continued to push Woolworth's profitable mall-based specialty operations. Managers sought out new ideas for stores, and those that the company liked were tried. If the stores were profitable, Woolworths opened more. If they were not profitable, the company tried another idea at the same location. In 1990, Woolworth opened 896 stores and closed 351. Many of the new ventures were specialty stores, such as Kinney's, Kids Marts, Foot Lockers, and Lady Foot Lockers. The latter two sold a full 20% of all brand-name athletic footwear in the United States in the late 1980s. The 40 types of specialty stores included Afterthoughts, seller of costume jewelry and handbags, Champs, seller of athletic goods and apparel, and Woolworth Express, seller of the fastest-moving goods of a traditional Woolworth. In 1993, Sells retired and was replaced by CFO William Lavin, who quickly made moves toward the elimination of the company's general merchandise stores in favor of an exclusive focus on specialty formats. 400 Woolworths were closed in the United States, and 122 Woolco stores in Canada were sold to Walmart, terminating Woolco altogether. Woolworth also sold 300 underperforming Kinney outlets and liquidated the 286-store Richmond Brothers/Anderson Little men's and women's clothing stores. Along with the nearly 1,000 stores, about 13,000 jobs were eliminated. As a result of these moves, the company recorded a $558 million charge, resulting in a net 1993 loss of $495 million. These radical moves were barely complete when an accounting scandal arose in early 1994, revolving around alleged false reporting of quarterly results during 1993. Several lawsuits were filed which were eventually combined into a class action lawsuit. This suit appeared to be settled by mid-1997 when Woolworth agreed to make undisclosed cash payments to affected shareholders. Later in 1994, Lavin was forced out, and Roger Farah became chairman and CEO in December 1994. Farah, a longtime department store manager who had most recently been president of R.H. Macy & Company, took over a Woolworth in shambles. Thanks to dwindling profits, by early 1995, the company was nearly out of cash, and short-term debt had swelled to $853 million. Consequently, Farah's first task was to improve cash flow in 1995. To do so, he broke Woolworth's string of 83 straight years of dividends, restructured company debt, reducing total debt by $475 million and shifting $290 million of short-term debt to longer-term financing, reduced operating spending by $100 million, wrote off $241 million of inventory, and began to sell off non-strategic chains and real estate. Early in 1995, Woolworth sold the RX Place chain of pharmacies for $37 million and the 331 Kids Mart/Little Folks children's clothing stores to the LFS Acquisition Investor Group for $15 million. Two other Canadian chains, Karuba and Canary Island, were also closed during the year. The various charges incurred as a result of these actions led to a net loss of $164 million. In 1996, Woolworth continued to restructure. Short-term debt was eliminated altogether, and total debt was reduced an additional $116 million. Another $100 million in operating spending was eliminated, and $222 million in cash was generated from the disposal of additional non-strategic chains and real estate. Among the divestments were the Accessory Lady chain in the United States, the Silk and Satin Lingerie chain in Canada, the Lady Plus apparel chain, the Reuben Jewelry chain, the Moderna shoe store chain, and the New Yorker jeans business, all in Germany, and the Gallery shoe store chain in Australia. All told, 1,443 unproductive stores were disposed of in 1995 and 1996. In the midst of these moves, institutional investor Greenway Partners forced to a vote a shareholder proposal to spin off Woolworth's Athletic Group, which included the profitable and growing Foot Locker and Champs chains. However, the plan was soundly defeated. Unlike his predecessor, Farah was not ready to give up on the neglected Woolworths chain. To better monitor and plan sales, point-of-sale equipment was installed at all locations in 1995, and purchasing, pricing policies, and promotional strategies were all centralized. He assembled a management team of veterans of successful high-volume specialty stores and streamlined merchandising systems. In 1996, the chain began testing new formats featuring higher quality and higher-priced merchandise, with more brand names. Based on customer surveys, the prototype stores were aimed at the time-pressed and budget-minded working woman looking for products for herself, her home, and her family. So, rather than carrying everything from hamsters to beach chairs, the product mix included more cosmetics and housewares. The antiquated lunch counters were replaced by small coffee bars. The three-store 1996 test was successful enough to justify an expansion of the test to 13 more stores in 1997. Overall, Woolworth's fortunes improved in the late 1990s, as the company posted a net profit of $169 million in 1996. The company appeared to be on track with the paring back of its unwieldy portfolio of retail formats. Farah began piecing together a sporting goods conglomerate on the foundation of Foot Locker and Champs Sports, acquiring the operations of Sporting Goods, Athletic Fibers, and Eastbay Incorporated, a Wausau, Wisconsin-based catalog company specializing in athletic footwear. Woolworth and Eastbay planned to develop catalogs for such Woolworth retail brands as Foot Locker and Champs. Nevertheless, in a telling psychological blow, Woolworth was replaced by Walmart on the Dow Jones Industrial Average in 1997. The chain experienced a $24 million operating loss for the first quarter as compared to a loss of $37 million for all of 1996. Unable to withstand such hemorrhaging long enough to turn the chain around, Woolworth announced on July 17, 1997, that it would close its more than 405 and dime stores in the United States, lay off about 9,200 Woolworths workers, and take a $223 million charge for the discontinued operations. The company planned to convert about 100 of the Woolworths locations to Foot Locker, Champs Sports, and other specialty formats. Although the Woolworths chain had seen the final chapter written on its history in the United States, the chain's saga would continue in Mexico and Germany, where about 70% of the five and dime still operated. The German stores were sold off in 1998. The company also announced that it planned to change its name, according to company literature, to better reflect its global specialty retailing formats. The new corporate name, the Venator Group, inspired by the Latin word for sportsman, was intended to describe a global team of retailers, invigorated by the challenge of winning in the world's marketplace. In preparation for the change, the company spent more than $130 million to streamline merchandising and back-office operations. Over the next 3 years, it went on to spend another $149 million to redesign the architecture of its information systems for the development of an integrated global retailing approach. In the United States, the Venator Group established 719 such stores and remodeled 582 in 1998. It simultaneously debuted its website, which featured virtual stores selling athletic footwear, equipment, apparel and accessories from the various Foot Lockers, Champ Sports, and Eastbay lines. The beginning of the 21st century was marked by a change in management at Venator. President Roger Farah resigned in 2000 to take over the top slot at Polo Ralph Lauren. Chairman and CEO Dale Hilpert resigned soon after to become CEO of Williams-Sonoma. Venator's board named COO Matthew Serra to replace both men in 2001. Although Hilpert and Farah had shared responsibility for refocusing the former discount store toward athletic apparel, Serra was the one responsible for bringing Foot Locker to prominence in its field of retail. Soon after Serra took over management of the corporation, Venator announced that it was closing its Northern Reflection stores in the United States in order to concentrate exclusively on athletic apparel. In the fall of 2001, this change was reflected when the Venator board voted to change the name of the corporation to Foot Locker Incorporated, which Woolworth started in 1974. The corporate history of Woolworth is legally included in the history of Foot Locker Incorporated, which is the legal continuation of Woolworth. As part of celebrating F.W. Woolworth's centennial on the New York Stock Exchange on June 26, 2012, a news release featured 1912 Woolworth store and a 2012 Foot Locker store. A Woolworths building still remains, albeit as an antique store in Bakersfield, California, and includes a still functioning diner.
It's May Value Days at Woolworth, with savings for everyone. There are lots of summer values. Great buys like women's brightly colored t-shirts in the latest styles. Now 2 for just $9. Save $4 on men's Woolworths Sprinter jogging shoes, just $13.97. And save $3 on boys' Sprinters, just $13.97.
Get your everyday store for value, 'cause at Woolworth your dollar goes far.
If you have any fond memories, please indicate it at the comments below. Thanks for watching, subscribe and like.